Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Pond, awards editor of TheWrap, and we're happy to have you here for our 2022 Emmy Award screening of two-sentence horror stories with a lot of the creative team behind the series. We're going to start by showing you a trailer, and then we'll go right into a conversation with our guests.
Let us take care of you.
I'm dreaming. This tech junk has taken over.
Don't give me that wounded animal look. I was looking out for you.
Brendan, this is not funny. Whenever he got angry, his demons would come out.
Welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce the series executive producer and plant life director Vera Meow, toxic director Chase Joint, Crush directors Kaylee and Sam Spear, Plant Life director of photography Guy Pools, and series composer Brittany Allen. Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Vera, let's start with you since the series started with you. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of this show and how you came to collaborate with Stage 13 on this.
It was just one of those funny Hollywood stories. I responded to a post about, a new studio that was looking for creators. I walked in there not knowing that it was Stage 13 and Warner Brothers. And they asked me some of the thoughts that I had about ideas and shows that I would want to make in a perfect world. And one of the ideas that I had was a show called Two-Sentence Horror Stories. Which I pitched as sort of a la Twilight Zone, sort of updated for the current day, an episodic psychological horror anthology series with a real commitment to, I think, a different kind of talent pool in front of and behind the camera. Mm-hmm. So that was the pitch, day one, and they seemed to like it. And fast forward to 4 seasons, 3 of which were on the CW and on Netflix later, and here we are.
Yeah. So was this inspired by the Reddit folder that's basically two-sentence horror stories?
Yeah, I'd come across some of the more viral two-sentence horror stories that had been posited on Reddit. And for those who don't know, on Reddit, there was, I think, a challenge thrown out to the Reddit community. Could you write an effective horror story in 2 sentences? And I just kind of fell in love with them from just a sort of a nerdy fan perspective. I thought as a literary device, it's just really interesting to try to condense something down to 2 sentences. And at the same time, to be able to do it in such a way that it kind of gave you some spooky thrills. It felt a little old school, sort of like a literary way of invoking the sense of sitting around a fire and sharing ghost stories. And it just tickled my fancy. And I thought that it would be, I think because when I would read some of the best of those sentences, I had stories and whole scenarios spin out in my brain just naturally. And I think that was why I thought it was fertile as a device to frame an anthology series.
Yeah. I mean, obviously in TV, there is this rich history of thought-provoking horror anthologies that, as you said, goes back to the Twilight Zone. Yeah. I mean, how did you want this one to stand out?
On one hand, I wanted it to be familiar. And if it ever came within a tiny fraction of proximity to the outer rim of Twilight Zone, I'd be ecstatic. So I really wanted to give people that experience of a good story told in an episodic form. But I think the way that I wanted it to stand out was really around the point of view and the perspectives that were centered in the story. Who was coming up with these ideas and what worldview was driving a conversation about what the real horrors are in current day. And I think that was built into my pitch. And so, the show really has, from the very beginning and all the way through, made a commitment to, prioritizing, the points of view of communities that we don't often see, frankly, centered still to this day in television. I know there's a big, public push towards what they call diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this was back in 2015 when I was having the conversations at Stage 13. And I think the push wasn't as significant then. But I would say that even in the landscape now, two-sentence horror stories continues to stand out as being the exception, right? Or I should say that other shows where the perspectives that we center across all of our episodes might be an exception. It's the rule on two-sentence horror stories. And I think it provides, most importantly, a different creative spin on some of the classic tropes and the classic sort of story formulas that we might see in psychological horror.
Right. Well, let's talk to a couple of your directors. Chase, what was it about this project that appealed to you that made you want to get involved?
The project as a whole or the episode? I mean, everything that Vera has just summarized is so exciting to me. I think that anchoring from minoritized POVs literally shifts the representational landscape of the kinds of projects that we create, And when I was first pitched Toxic, the episode from this season, I was told it was about toxic masculinity and toxic friendship. But I was also reading the pages through the lens of white supremacy and a kind of radicalized misogyny that often gets cast through phrases like boys will be boys. And, what I liked about the episode and the writing in Toxic in particular was that we're given these glimmers and these chances to imagine a world otherwise. And I think that those opportunities to imagine the world otherwise are laced throughout the show.
Mm-hmm. Right. Sam and Kaylee, what about you? What appealed to you about getting involved with this?
Yeah, the same that they were saying. It's so exciting to have different stories told from different perspectives and focusing on characters that we don't usually see on TV and having them be the center of the stories. So we were really excited about all the episodes, but especially we had a lot of fun with Crush. So Crush was specifically fun for us. We the leads of that episode are identical twin women in their 70s, played by the wonderful Jackie and Joyce Robbins. And it was just such an amazing experience to be able to be twins, directing twins, and chat with them about just their experience being twins and being able to bring that onto screen. It's something that we, being twins, we very rarely see twins represented as actual human beings, individual humans. Individual human beings with a different kind of complicated relationship. And so to be able to be a part of bringing that to screen was just, it was a dream.
And also age too on screen, you don't see often in the center piece. And they were amazing to work with. And we've wanted to work with them for a long time now. We always cross paths at film events and stuff, but we've never had the chance to work together. So we were so stoked to be brought on board this one.
Right. So Vera, did you have this story about twins and go looking for twin directors?
Well, Sam and Kaylee, we were lucky enough to have them direct on the previous season. And sort of the way that it all came about actually is Liz Levine, our executive producer in Canada, said to me, there are these amazing actresses here in Vancouver, these twin women, in their 70s, and they could be, a character in an episode. And she exposed me to them, and I was like, well, why aren't they the episode, and it sort of came from there. This sort of, I started thinking about Grey Gardens and the ways in which that documentary is a horror story in and of itself, and how we might be able to do a little bit of an homage while exploring, the themes about codependent familial ties and elder abuse and sort of predatory behavior. And then I'm going to take full credit. I was like, Sam and Kaylee need to direct these twins because I want the promotional material of twins directing twins I mean, it's just, it kind of writes itself, frankly. So it was a sort of a moment of kismet where, we didn't have a pre-existing story. We actually had the talent. And then that sort of immediately, exploded into, a really fantastic story. And I was honestly extremely excited to center characters who were in their 70s. And it's particularly unusual on the network that we premiered the episode on, which is CW. Though I think the demographics of CW's audience is much broader than one might assume. But I've always had a particular love of centering, folks who are older. And I think that those characterizations and as lead roles with dimensional personalities and stories is a little too rare. So it was just this great opportunity to make it all happen.
Mm-hmm. Right. And one of the wonderful things about that episode is you start out thinking of them as being fragile and perhaps being victims, and it ends up being something very, very different than that.
Yeah, totally.
So I think is a little bit of twisted wish fulfillment, at least some of the time.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about a different kind of diversity to you, Brittany, because usually if you're hired to be the composer on a series, you will come up with, themes and a musical vocabulary that you'll be able to use variations on through the whole series. With this, each episode can be a completely different style than the one before it and the one after it. And I would imagine that sort of complicates things as a composer, because you have to do, a variety of different musical styles within, from one episode to the next.
Yeah, it's both the challenge and the joy of scoring an anthology. You do get to try something new with every episode and really kind of go, okay, what is the sound of this episode? What's, am I approaching this with more classical string elements and piano? And in the case of Crush, that was kind of more the direction we went in, because, they've got this history of being, one of them is a performer, and I actually wrote the song and sang the song as well, that she, she's watching a video of at one point that was pretty fun actually, because she falls off the stage at the end of that video. So I really got to lean into the actor side of me for that moment. But then you contrast that with Toxic, which was, really quite experimental and electronic. And it was more about, I have a couple of analog synthesizers and I just made a bunch of sounds. And, with every episode, I do come at things from an actor's perspective, because I've been an actor for most of my life, and prior to composing, that's what I did. And so what I love about Two Sentence Horror Stories is that it's a combination of pushing the bounds of sound through the horror. Is this an electronic horror? Is this, vocal horror? How can I push kind of sounds to their darkest, ugliest place that somehow makes me feel the way the horror does, but also what's the heart of the story? And all of these stories do have so much heart, and that's what I love.
Right. Well, let's talk about the look of Plant Life. Guy, I mean, you're dealing with an episode that starts in this very high-tech sort of angular environment, and it gets gradually a lot messier and a lot more organic. So as the DP, how do you approach that? How do you chart those changes visually?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the fun of the episode laid in its sort of minimalism. You've got one character acting for the most part opposite a plant in a single location. But the joy of this episode for me came from not just getting to work with Vera again, who I loved working with in 2016 on the digital version of the show, but with this episode, we got to essentially build a set from scratch and design it to shape it to the needs of the episode, which is not something you always get to do on every episode of this show. And so it was a real luxury to be able to work with Vera and Danielle and Robin, the art director and production designer, and be able to really pick out the minutiae of every tone of color and lamp fixture and piece of set dressing within the set, so that the whole thing sort of felt simultaneously like a bit of a cave that had closed itself off from the outside world, the way the character has, but also feel like a space that was comfortable, so that this character has found comfort in his isolation, which is unfortunately driving the person that he loves away from him. But yeah, sort of tracking that, and then having this sort of like wonderfully decorated, very nice industrial space begin to just get covered in goop and ooze and slime was fun. Messiness is fun.
Yeah, and I mean, and lighting. It's pretty much all artificial lighting in there, right? I mean, you don't really see a lot of light coming through the windows much.
Yeah, that's the window. Well, I mean, a lot of it was production requirements. There was just nothing outside the windows, so you had to kind of grub them up, so not much light is coming in. But also, it was fun to work to just, I love keying off practical sources wherever I can. It adds sort of an honesty and naturalism to the look of, the cinematography of the show. And it was really fun to be able to literally just key off the screens of laptops and the screens of monitors and just utilize, either the overhead counter lights in the kitchen or the desk lamps in the study, and just embrace the kind of honesty and the technology of those items.
Yeah, right. Well, Vera, you directed that episode, and you hadn't directed since season 1, right?
I directed the digital season and season 1 of the CW season.
Right. Yeah. So what makes you think, okay, this episode I want to direct?
I think a couple of things. I think just personally, in my own headspace, I'm just really interested in any sort of attempts to sort of muddle through this thing that we have on our plate, which is environmental deterioration. It's just an issue that is really important to me, and something that I'm exploring more and more in my work. But also at the end of the day, it's a love story, and I'm a sucker for love stories. And I just felt like the combination of the two was, it just called to me, and I could see the story, right? That this interplay between, what you can imagine signifies the digital kind of man-made, machine-driven world. And what I call, digital or artificial intelligence, and the organic kind of kingdom of natural intelligence, which is the natural world. And the way the two of them, we get to interact with on all levels in the story, visually, sonically, and frankly, obviously over the course of the episode, the take on the story is that natural intelligence at the end of the day, is the one that prevails, and we are the ones that have to learn how to live with it, which is honestly a message that I can get with. So yeah, it was kind of a no-brainer. I was always attracted to the script. And Stephanie Adams Santos, who wrote it, she's a wonderful writer, and also someone who feels both of those tones, both environmental issues and love stories, really deeply. And she was a joy to work with. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, let's talk a little more about the other episodes that are represented here. Chase, for you, I mean, Toxic, we should say it's basically a group of guys who are spending one last night in the woods before one of them goes off to Yale. And some practical jokes go very, very wrong. And it's mostly shot, I guess, outdoors in the forest somewhere. So, I mean, for you, what were the keys to filming that, and what were the biggest challenges?
Oh, there's nothing like shooting overnights in a forest somewhere near Vancouver to keep you honest. I, as a trans masculine person, I've witnessed toxic masculinity from both an insider and an outsider status and perspective. And, I think the thing to really take seriously in the episode, but also, in broader culture, is that, of course, the problem isn't men. It's patriarchy. It's a system designed to reward and privilege certain kinds of people over others. And so, the episode for me was a playground to try and put pressure on those issues, things like peer pressure and shame and competition, and things that get baked in as individual problems, but that are actually societal. And sometimes you got to drag your own moon around the forest to make those points, and you've got to enlist a cohort of young strapping actors who are willing to dig deep and to hang out with you all night, and to actually find those empathetic moments of connection within themselves, which I think elevate and escalate the horror elements throughout.
Mm-hmm. Right. So how long do you get to film one of these? I mean, they're 20-minute episodes, so do you have enough time? I mean, Chase, how long did you have out there in the woods outside Vancouver?
We get 5 days prep and 5 days in the woods.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we use every minute of those opportunities.
Right.
Just have to give huge props to the crew and all the department heads, because this is a hard show. We're a scrappy production, and you don't get to carry any of the costs or the labor over episode to episode. And in fact, given the nature of it, you actually have to fight against it. You actually can't have similarities. And that's from the beginning of story ideation into the development of the scripts, all the way through to, the prep and the production of shooting, and all the way through post. And Brittany's like, nothing can feel like we've been here before. And as the seasons go on, that becomes a larger and larger challenge, and such a heavier and heavier weight on the crew. Doesn't get to sort of be able to sit back and be like, I built that set and now we can rest. Actually, they build that set and then they start prepping on building the next one. They have to, all that amazing work has to be torn down. Like Guy said, the plant life set was gorgeous, and then it was torn down in the blink of an eye. It was painful.
Mm-hmm.
Also what the show requires.
Yeah, because then it was transformed into the hoarder's house.
Yeah. So Brittany, how much time do you have if they're on these 5-day shoots? When do you get the footage, and how much time do you have to turn around a score?
Well, I was going to add on to what Vera said, which was that, there's this feeling of satisfaction when you complete an episode and you're proud of yourself, but you don't really have much time to celebrate, because, you maybe allow yourself a minute or two, and then right away, that the next episode is due a week from then. So that it starts out, you kind of think you've got about 2 weeks per episode, because I suppose from the moment I see the locked cut, it is about 2 weeks until, my entire, the score for the entire episode is due. But when they start stacking up on top of each other, you really only have 2 weeks for the first episode. And then it's about a week moving forward.
Right. Vera, when you're hiring for this show, I mean, my understanding is the writer's room is 100% female and 80% BIPOC. And I mean, what are your, is that really crucial for you in hiring people behind the scenes, and hiring writers and hiring directors, that they represent viewpoints we don't normally see?
I think I would answer it in the yes. I would back it up in two different directions. One is, that is the essence of the show. And so, you want to hire people who know what that point of view is, so that they can bring some complexity and nuance, which we need pretty badly. You need that sort of jump start in homegrown perspective when you have 20 minutes and you're trying to pack a lot of story and a lot of character. And, it's a challenge, telling stories. I've had the experience both of, obviously TV, in which you have the same characters across multiple episodes, and then also this show, which is a completely different, end of the spectrum. And so you got to have the folks who get it from the beginning, so you're a little bit ahead of the game. Because the task ahead is actually kind of daunting if you want to do just the characters in particular. The other thing that I would say, and this is an encouragement that I would make to all of, the wonderful showrunners and executive producers and TV creators out there, right, in this conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. My first and foremost argument is exactly that. Creatively, product-wise, storytelling-wise, it's really powerful. And that's the number one point of, sort of thing going for it. The other thing too is like, we're not going to make any change until we make the change in our own projects. So, and definitely have to give some props to CW as a network, who understood that was, the commitment and the personality and the DNA of the show. And so really did, end up supporting all of our choices. I mean, frankly, one of the things that I'm really proud about with the show is that we have brought a ton of people into the Writers Guild and the Directors Guild. Through simply hiring on the show, as opposed to being like, well, because it's a network television show, we should hire people with previous network television experience. That's great if it makes sense, but it's not the primary sort of list on my priorities for the talent putting the show together. And I think that, if the spirit of the show is centralizing people who aren't typically centralized in stories, gives us a fresh perspective on the creative, you want to see it all the way through, including into your hiring. So otherwise, it's a little bit more of an outside in kind of approach to that, which seems not even from like a philosophical or values-based perspective, it just seems sort of inefficient. So yeah.
Yeah. And at the beginning of the conversation, we talked about the Twilight Zone. And, one thing that was very clear when you watch the Twilight Zone, you got a sense of what people were thinking about and worrying about in the 1960s. And as a successor to that kind of show, I wonder, and I open this to everybody on the panel, how do you think Two Sentence Horror Stories is a show for this era? And maybe, Guy, you want to start on this since we haven't heard from you in a while?
I think if you're making a horror show or a horror movie or anything, and you're not tapping into some sort of very present, conscious, real fear in greater society, you're probably doing something wrong. What I really love about this show is the ability to take very specific topics, and I think it's pretty clear with each episode that deals with a societal topic what it is that is being dealt with, and I think it's really cathartic for me just to work with directors through these fears and anxieties, and a lot of them I hold myself, and it's really enlightening to not just see other people's perspectives on them, but also to kind of examine my own attitudes towards them as I build a visual language with a director and break down a script.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, Chase, for you, I imagine when you're making Toxic, you're not thinking so much, I'm making a Lost in the Woods horror movie, as you are thinking, I'm making something about this, this issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because, early on, I was, of course, thinking about references like Lord of the Flies, but also comps like Stand By Me, right? Precious portraits of friendship that go strange and wrong in different ways. And, I think you have to hold all of those considerations simultaneously. And one of the things that I love about the show and the encouragement of the show's creators and leaders is it's about exteriorizing internal processes. And so how can we think together about how best to do that? And I love the different formal moves and collaborations that shift and change throughout the episodes, because you can really see how we all take up that charge differently based on our own socio-political vantage points.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, Sam and Kaylee, you're making a show about two women who are lost in the past in a certain way, but are you thinking about about how it reflects to today?
Yeah. I mean, for that story, it's interesting because the issue at the heart of it has many layers. So it's about elder abuse, but it's also, the cool thing about that story was that because the leads were older women, we didn't really need to have like any bigger, greater issue than just like let them have a story and be present and go through all of the dynamics that they were going through. And that in itself is like tackling change that we want to see on TV. So not necessarily like having to, like tackle issues in like, say, the other episodes that we were doing. Just like letting them be present and dynamic and being able to be the villain and not like explore elder abuse, but then like let them take charge, and we don't need to like have a character sweeping in to help them. So that's what we found really cool about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting with, I mean, across the board with this show, the different ways that each episode handles their the issue that's at the heart of it, and like being an anthology and being able to have different characters at the center of all of them, it allows to create different structures for talking about these issues. So some might hit them straight on in a really in bold kind of way, and some might sneak in through the side, and the allowances for the creativity in that way are, I think, really special about this show.
Yeah, different ways to get into the conversations.
Yeah, I think following up on that, I know there's a lot to be said about social horror, I think is a term that's floated around a bit for a minute there. And there's a lot of conversation about two-sentence horror stories in the context of social issues that we might tackle through the episodes. I just want to say that I think there's a false dichotomy between the idea of the personal and the social. I think we're people in society. And so, I think that's a lot more porous and a lot more entangled than sometimes we approach it when we think about how to break story or how to talk about story. And I think the elasticity and the range that, Sam and Kaylee are talking about comes from that understanding, right? That, I don't think, in my opinion, there's no personal story that doesn't acknowledge the world around us and how it works on us and how then we interact with it. And there's no story about the world around us and greater issues without drilling down into people, how it plays out and impacts people. And so everything else, I think, is made up. Frankly, it's a fiction to be able to disentangle the two. So, with the show, the encouragement is always they go hand in hand. How they play out in 20 minutes may vary, like whatever the best path is to explore our character, whether the character has a more interior experience in those 20 minutes or one that is in conversation with larger forces and contexts around them. That's up to the writers, in the room, and, the script, and then the directors interpret all of that, right? But intrinsic to the show is the belief that is actually, if we're going to tell a story that actually speaks to lived experience, you have to understand that there is no separating the person from the collective.
Right. Everybody, thanks very much for for a very enlightening conversation.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.